Hello viewers, you are watching Tigray Media House from Washington DC. My name is Stalin Gabraslasey. My guest today is Dr. Tsagaye Arasa from Melbourne, Australia. Dr. Tsagaye Arasa is a Melbourne-based legal scholar who specializes in Ethiopian constitutional law, federalism, and human rights law. Thank you for accepting my invitation, Doctor.
Thank you, Stalin. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. What's going on in Ethiopia? Ethiopia seems to be in a very serious crisis. What's wrong with Ethiopia?
Well, it's true. There is a very, very alarming deepening crisis at this point in time in Ethiopia. And as you are probably familiar, as we speak today, there is a renewed protest movement that is called by Kero Oromia, by the young protesters in Oromia region, which is the largest region in the country, which is also one of the units of the federation. This crisis has started it has got quite a background now. It has been here since around 2013, 2014, when there was a protest against the Addis Ababa master plan. And the Oromo youth have been protesting against the expansion of the city administration's jurisdiction into the Oromia territory. And that created a lot of unrest. And as you remember, there were a number of emergency declarations and lots of repressive measures taken, lots of prolonged protest movement that went on. And in the end, in 2018, it forced the resignation of the then Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn. After that, that protest movement and the fundamentally implausible situation the country was stuck in led to an internal dialogue about the change that is needed in the country. And I think the leadership at the time, which is formed of 4 coalition parties, which form a big Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. Within them, they started a dialogue. The dialogue was how we can respond to the demands of the people, the demands of the protesters, and get out of the crisis that the protest movement has got us into. And of course, there was a lot of self-reflection, looking at one's performance as EPRDF. All the coalition parties went into a series of evaluation, Gimgama, as it is known among them, as it is part of their tradition. They started to renew the political parties' leadership. And in the renewing of the leadership, in the changing of the leadership process, there started a power struggle, an internal power struggle between the leaders of the 4 members that formed the coalition of EPRDF. And that power struggle led to a very tactical alliance and counter-alliance formed within EPRDF, within the leadership's series of meetings. And in the end, Abiy Ahmed from the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, or PDO, became the nominee for the leadership of the EPRDF, the bigger coalition of the party that was ruling the country. And by that, ex officio, he became the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, replacing Haile Mariam Desalegn. And that happened in the end of around the end of the year 2017, and then formally in March this process was completed. And in April 2018, Abiy Ahmed was actually inaugurated into office as a prime minister. Abiy Ahmed, an ethnic Oromo, at least someone who self-describes as an Oromo, came into power. In part, it was seen at the time as a concession to the Oromo protest movement that forced the regime to change. And of course, Abiy promised a lot of reform, and one of the reforms that were promised is that they will listen to the people, that they will liberalize the political situation, they liberalize the political space, that they will respond to the demands of the people appropriately, efficiently, adequately. That
what were the demands? Are the Oromos now expecting? I mean, do they have over expectation from the prime minister? Now he's leading the country. He's not an Oromo first, because he's the prime minister of Ethiopia. So he has so many things to do at the federal level. What was their expectation as an Oromo?
Yes, there was a lot of expectation indeed, not because he is an Oromo, but because they made promises. And the promises were, first, of course, to respond to the just demands of the protesters, number one. Number two, to respond to the age-long thirst for democratic freedom in that country, for more respect for human rights, for more inclusive political space, and so on and so forth. As far as the Oromo was concerned, at the time, the mantra of the protest movement was, number one, stop the master plan and the eviction from lands, from land that were being granted to the investors in different parts of the country. And in fact, there was a demand for a just compensation for expropriation of land from the farmers and dedicating it to investors. That was number one. Secondly, there were demands for self-rule in Oromia region without any intervention, any interference from the federal government. This, they said, is part of the requirement, part of the principle of federalism, in which regions rule themselves at the state level and then co-govern together at the federal level. And they called for a stronger federal system in which self-rule of the states is respected. And thirdly, they called for linguistic justice. One of the arguments, one of the demands were that the Ethiopian, the working language of Ethiopia be multiplied. So far, it was only Amharic that was the working language of the federal government, and they wanted the language of the majority, the ethnic majority in the country, the Oromo language. Afan Oromo should be, they said, one of the working languages of the federal government. Of course, there could be more, but that was one of the demands. And third was the issue of the capital city. The capital city, the protesters argued, is an Oromo city. In fact, legally, it's also the capital city of Oromia. However, within that capital city, there is no recognition of the Oromo presence. There's no recognition of the ownership of that city as an Oromo city. In fact, there is a progressive process of pushing out the ethnic Oromos from the city, as even when the city is expanding further deep into the Oromia region. And one of the demands was that the jurisdiction line, the boundary between the city administration, the land which the city administration has a jurisdiction over, and the remaining part of Oromia be demarcated. This is one of the demands of the protesters, because without that being demarcated, the development plans, such as the master plan, were basically a way of eroding the self-rule of Oromia, the special interests of Oromos have over the capital city, the federal capital city, and so on and so forth. So those were the questions that were really hot and that needed a response from the prime minister. And one of the claims that the prime minister made in a very populist and popular move at the time was that our lords, the people we are accountable to, the people we like to hear and respond to, are only the Oromo people as far as the OPDO is concerned, but the Ethiopian people, not any other person, no interference, self-rule shall be respected, and so on and so forth. Apart from that, Prime Minister Abiy, from the very get-go, promised winds of change, promised that the status quo is unlivable. He said that we're going to change. The country is going to have
the international community believes the Prime Minister has done a lot of reforms, and maybe the Oromo people were expecting more than that in the Oromia regional state, or what?
The international community, of course, believed because of some international activities that the Prime Minister did. He got himself involved in, one of which is basically the peace with Eritrea. As you remember, there was a conflict between Eritrea, a border conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and there was a pending issue of demarcation of the boundaries as decided by the ICJ. And the Prime Minister said, I will agree to that unconditionally, although we don't have anything in material, concrete terms in terms of what exactly they have agreed upon. And the main reason why the international community thought Abiy was doing well, and so much so that they even gave him the Nobel Peace Prize, is because he made peace, quote unquote, he made peace with Eritrea. Now, that is a very irrelevant issue as far as the protesters are concerned, because people were struggling, they were paying lots of sacrifice, they were dying under a repressive regime, not for the regime to bring peace with Eritrea, but basically to live in dignity on their land without eviction, to have a just compensation for land expropriated from them and given over to investors, to have a legitimate say in the administration of the city, to have their constitutional special interest in the city respected, to have their language become one of the federal working languages. These are the priority issues that basically laid people to the streets and laid them to risk everything they have, lives, limbs, and livelihoods. Now, when the Prime Minister came and started to talk about other issues, international issues, regional issues, for the Oromo public, it's not a bad idea. Most thought he's making us proud, but that's not the question we demanded. Focus, get back to us, and respond to our questions. But progressively, Abiy Ahmed veered away from the domestic issues that propelled him to power and started to set a new agenda, new political program. In fact, militating exactly against the demands of the Oromo public and the other nations, nationalities, and peoples in Ethiopia. Militating against them in the sense that he basically undermined the state autonomy of the regions. He denied the right of statehood of the Sidama, for example. He started to think of restructuring the federal arrangement to basically
Sidamas were granted statehood under the leadership of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed.
But after a lot of fight, Abiy Ahmed resisted it, even resisted to organize a referendum. Then there was a military action to suppress the demands for a referendum. And then the referendum was, after a delayed time, after 5 months delay, the referendum was conducted. 98.7% of the population decided for yes to be a state. And then even then the Prime Minister came out and said, yes, the people have decided, but not us. We have to think about it. We have to discuss about it. We have to study it. That's word by word the statement of the Prime Minister to the Sidama public. And then there was a study group that was established. There was another committee, national committee, that was established to rethink the Sidama decision to become a state. In fact, to join them with the Gedio, the Amharo, and the Burji people, and to make Amharic a co-working language of the region, to negotiate about the city of Hawassa, which is the capital of the region, and so on and so forth. It was a very traumatic process that finally led to the independence as a state, independence as a state within the federation of the Sidama region. In fact, there was a political gimmick there, a political trade-off. The trade-off is that the leadership will support Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party, and that's exactly what they did. They said having the state and ensconcing it as part of the federation is more important, and is more important than having a fight with Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party. So that was how the Sidama did it. But across the board, there were so many demands from the southern region, for example, about 12 or 11 demands for statehood. Those were denied. Everywhere there is a move towards changing the federal arrangement and veering away, drifting away from the arrangement that gives expression to national self-determination. And that made people threatened. That made people, the struggles there, the feel that the struggles they have been fighting for are threatened. That's what you see in Tigray. That's what you see in all other regions. This is because Abiy Ahmed's political program became an agenda that wasn't part of the popular protest movement during the protest time. So because of that, people started, at first, to have a discontent, to feel disaffected. Then they felt threatened. Then, as he began to take actions that are directly against the Oromo interests, for example, the regional autonomy that they were actually wanting to expand was actually diminished when Abiy Ahmed removed the popular president, Lamma Magarsa, and replaced him by his own cronies. The second, when he started a war on insurgents in some parts of Oromia without an invitation from the Oromia regional state, B, without any state of emergency declared according to the constitution of the Oromia regional state within the parliament of the region, which is Jaffe Oromia. He went on and waged a war and established a command post system and later an state of emergency, and started to suspend the civil administration of the region and impose a command post system in which military administration have had a precedence. And these things...
Doctor, are the insurgents legally operating in Ethiopia?
Well, I was about...
Don't you think Prime Minister Abiy is the Prime Minister of Ethiopia and he has every right in his jurisdiction?
Well, Prime Minister Abiy is a Prime Minister of Ethiopia, and he, however, has a constitution to rule by. And according to the constitution, that country is a federation. And in a federation, there are ways of acting as a prime minister. You are not like, and it's a parliamentary system, mind you. And in a federation,
it's the security of the nation.
Yes, even then, it has to be brought to the regional parliament's attention. And if the region cannot control the situation, then the federal government should issue a state of emergency. But this is the thing. What happened with regard to this? Where did these insurgents come from? These are factions of the Oromo Liberation Army. These are members who used to be part of the Oromo Liberation Front, and these are the military wing of the Oromo Liberation Front. The Oromo Liberation Front has been conducting a war of liberation, and it has been basically banned from the country as a terrorist organization, and it was operating from Eritrea mainly. And when Abiy Ahmed came to power, and this is one of the reforms that he promised and he kind of half delivered, and the promise was to pluralize the political space, to liberalize the system. One of the liberalization efforts was to allow all political parties operating from outside to come into the country and conduct their politics peacefully. And so accordingly, the Oromo Liberation Front, led by Daud Ibsa and some other factions as well, who were operating from Asmara, were negotiating a peace deal, and they were allowed into the country. And since September 2018, they were part of the political process in Addis Ababa. Now, however, one thing was pending all the time. When they agreed to come home, the thing they had agreed was to demobilize the military, to disarm the military, the Liberation Army, and to integrate the soldiers into the national security, the national military and regional military system. However, once the leadership has gone into Addis Ababa, what happened was that the prime minister's part of the deal wasn't honored. And they were waiting. And without any clear program of demobilization, disarmament, and integration into the national security system, they were asked only to put down their guns. And a faction that wasn't in Eritrea, that was clandestinely operating in some parts of Oromia, in the south, in Borana area, and in the west, in Walaga area, said, no, we have no guarantee that our demands will be honored if we put down our arms. And so they continued to stay in the bush. And the Oromo leadership, the Oromo Liberation Front leadership in Addis Ababa said, well, you have to deal with this. And the prime minister wasn't honoring his part of the deal. And when that happened, they said, look, we've come here trusting your word and to do politics in peaceful ways, but we don't have our army. Our army has been delivered to you. Now, they said, this one is not ours anymore because they are not willing to communicate with us. Now, what happened was there was a negotiation going on to disarm this insurgent group, this faction too. And the negotiation was with the political leadership in Addis Ababa, with all other Oromo political parties, mediated by the traditional leaders, the Abagada. And this was tried to be achieved. And again, the political leadership of the Oromo Liberation Front agreed, and in fact said to the Abagadas, to the traditional leaders, saying, please take this army into your fold and do whatever you want. From now on, I don't have any military I command. I am a peaceful political practitioner here. So after that moment, the prime minister didn't do anything. So because they weren't responded to properly, the insurgents continued to operate in the western part of the country and in the southern part of the country. And that was supposed to be dealt with legally. What do you do? First, peace and security in the region should be respected primarily by the regional police force. And the regional police force, when it fails to do it, it invites federal intervention legally. There is a way to do it. They write a letter, according to the Constitution, to the Federation, the House of Federation. The House of Federation orders the Prime Minister or any other legitimate authority to go in and do the peace and security work that's needed in the region. If it is beyond even this, then the federal government in the federal parliament, through the Prime Minister, can initiate a state of emergency, to declare a state of emergency based on which the federal military or any security apparatus can be mobilized to handle this insurgency. What happened was action by political fiat. In fact, there was a lot of bravado that in 2 weeks that they will eliminate all insurgents and they will be winning them. They will be defeating them all in all. And they couldn't, and it went on, and atrocities were perpetrated throughout by all sides, I suppose. But then the reports from international community, international human rights movements, NGOs, has been clear that the government took very, very massive repressive measures in the name of law enforcement in those areas. So that is where it was. So the Prime Minister, yes, was a federal Prime Minister, and Oromos shouldn't own him alone and expect him to serve only their interests. That's true. But the one thing people should always remember is that the Prime Minister, as an Ethiopian Prime Minister, is also the Prime Minister of Oromos. So the Oromo question also concerns him. While he attends to everyone in the country, the demands of the Oromo people are also part of the demands of the Ethiopian people that he needs to serve. But for almost a year, when we were demanding that the Prime Minister doesn't care about Oromo issues, people were saying, but he's the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. Yes, but he's also a Prime Minister of Oromos in Ethiopia. And that was a way of pushing away the demands of the Oromos.
Do you think there is no over-expectation from the Oromia side?
There is obviously an over-expectation, but a legitimate over-expectation. Why? 2 reasons. One, the concession from the regime, from the very start, the concession from the regime to give power to the Oromo party within the EPRDF coalition is because the pressure from the bottom came from Oromia. The thing that necessitated the change within EPRDF is the Oromo protest movement. That's number one. Number two, he assumed power because he leads an Oromo political organization, the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, or PDO. So he took power on the might of the protest of the Oromo people, using an Oromo national list organization and claiming or promising to respond to all the demands of the Oromos. And these were the promises that he made. And so there is an expectation in Oromia from him, more than perhaps there was an expectation elsewhere because of these things. He is an Oromo, self-described Oromo. He comes from an Oromo nationalist party, which governs the Oromian region. He was given that chance within the EPRDF because he is an Oromo. It was kind of a concession from the part of the regime to the Oromo party, where there is a lot of problem. And then they came out, he and his team member, his colleague Lamma Magarsa, came out and said to the people, we are here to respond to your demands. If we can't, no, this is what they said. We will respond to your demands. If we can't, we'll fight to get a response for your demands with you, alongside with you. But we will not.
So what went wrong in the process? What went wrong in the process?
Well, in the process, I think the whole change process was the whole change thing. The reform was hijacked. That's what I was trying to say when I said the question of the Oromos.
Oromos have they were claiming the Oromos have been marginalized economically, politically in the past over a century in Ethiopian history. Now Oromos are controlling the highest position in the country. The Prime Minister Abiy is an Oromo from Oromia, represented by OPDO and the governing Ethiopian ruling party of Prime Minister Haile Mariam. Desalegn was forced to resign because of the protests in Oromia, claiming for political and economic power at the federal level. Now Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. Now he's an Oromo, and many Oromo people are feeling targeted and betrayed. What does it mean to the Oromo people?
True. That's precisely the point where the trauma begins, the pain of the Oromos begins, that this is a person who rode on the Oromo plight to his power, rode on their concern, their issues, their demands to go into the national palace. After he got there, instead of answering their demands, responding to their demands, he actually began to set a new agenda. And most of the new programs he set are not just alien to the demands and expectations of the Oromo people. They are, in fact, contrary to the demands and expectations of the Oromo people. The expectation was that, in the meantime, some of the pressing concerns, the pressing issues will be responded, like stopping the eviction, offering a fair and just compensation for expropriation, getting some access to social services in terms of achieving redistributive justice, in terms of achieving social justice, and so on and so forth. And then create a process in which a system in which a democratic election will be held in the near future according to the Constitution, and people will select or elect their own politicians of their own choice, and through that, they will pursue all the other demands in a constitutional manner. One of the reasons why the frustrations came and the sense of betrayal came is because Prime Minister Abiy did not only set a new agenda that have nothing to do with the people's demands, but also because he simply postponed the election. How did he do it? First, the National Electoral Board, they said, was not prepared enough. Then when it is prepared, then they used the coronavirus, the COVID-19 phenomenon, which happened recently since last March. And they used that as an excuse for not conducting the election according to the plan. Then they actually went on to say that we need to have a constitutional interpretation process to fill the gap, to fill the power vacuum that may be created for the time during which there will be no election. And that was a very, very serious mistake that Abiy Ahmed made, because people said, okay, don't respond to our questions, our demands, that's fine, but just get us into the stage where we have elections and we will select our own officials and they will pursue our demands. They will try to answer, respond to our demands. But then the hope that was invested in the election was shattered because the election was moved first, and then postponed indefinitely. And that created a sense in which after September 2020, Prime Minister Abiy is going to rule without any mandate of election and without any legality, because according to the Constitution, the term of office of the Parliament and of the Prime Minister ends in October 2020. So, given this situation, given the fact that he is moving into a realm of illegality, given the situation that the people have nothing to hope for in order to gain responses from the government for their demands in the absence of elections, then the frustration was mounting and people felt sincerely betrayed. The change was hijacked. Yes, a set of agenda that were put in the table every day were completely something that was not related to what the people demanded. And most often they were completely unconstitutional and they were beyond what the system was offering. And mind you, the demands of the protesters, the Oromos in Ethiopia, was for effective implementation of the constitutions, for realizing the constitutional promise of self-rule and shared rule, the constitutional promise of self-determination, the constitutional promise of sovereignty over our one's own natural resources. These were the demands they were looking for. And the Prime Minister was basically not just drifting away from the Constitution, but issuing series of laws that were unconstitutional, and finally trying to extend his power without any constitutional mandate.
Mm-hmm. I have a very brief video, and we will talk about the video later.
July is a month that celebrates democracy and liberty, from America's celebrations this week to France's Bastille Day that's coming up soon. But this July, we should really note something else, the erosion of democracy, one more grim consequence of COVID. As Larry Diamond noted in a recent Atlantic article, democracies were already weakening over the last decade. The pandemic pushed open the door for an autocratic power grab, and many leaders jumped at the opportunity, all in the name of fighting the disease, of course. Ethiopia's fragile transition to democracy is now under threat. The parliament postponed that nation's first free and fair election, and then it extended the prime minister's term without input from opposition parties. In Malaysia, the new reformist government was effectively closed due to COVID-19, and recently ousted corrupt leaders returned to positions of power while the opposition has been shut out. Perhaps most notably, Hungary's populist leader Viktor Orban was granted emergency powers to rule by decree in March. But the state of the emergency ended, observers worry that Orban's extraordinary powers are here to stay. Hungary's law also allowed officials to punish the publication of what they determined was fake COVID news with jail time. In fact, data from the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law found that pandemic responses in 40 countries curtailed free expression in this way. From India and Indonesia to Nepal and Nicaragua, governments cracked down on free press and on critics, all in the name of supposedly fighting misinformation. Now, Tunisia took the entirely opposite approach, its cabinet promising public funds to independent media to stay afloat as the pandemic cripples the economy there. Indeed, if you look closely, the pandemic has actually strengthened people's desires for democracy. South Korea's recently socially distant vote actually had the country's highest turnout in almost 30 years. Malawi's vote, a rerun on a contested election, also ran smoothly, bringing to power the opposition leader. And the world's largest ever civil rights protests show that civic engagement is alive and well. Even the lockdown protests indicate the health of free assembly. In Germany, the Constitutional Court overturned a ban on demonstrations, ruling that, pandemic or not, the people had a right to protest. And that country still managed to bring down infection rates quickly and has so far avoided any second wave. And that is the ultimate irony of these political maneuvers. Democracies from South Korea to Germany have shown themselves to be perfectly capable of handling this disease without any new emergency powers. And at that very moment, demagogues are using this very pandemic to destroy democracy.
Doctor, what's your take in the context of Ethiopia?
Yes, I think I should fully agree with Farid Zakaria here, and of course Larry Diamond, whom he quotes at the start of his discussion. The first thing he says is that democracies are under threat, and there is a growing erosion of democracy because of the COVID-19 phenomenon. And that's true in many parts of the world, and Ethiopia is one of them, and it's very accurate that they actually named Ethiopia as the first one to come to mind, as the first example in here. And indeed, Ethiopia is one of the classic examples where there is a crackdown in the name of preventing, handling the COVID. And very interestingly, in the discussion that that Prime Minister Abiy used to try to extend his power unconstitutionally, one of the expert witnesses, who was called into the interpretation process in the Constitutional Inquiry Council in Ethiopia, if you recall, he was Andreas Eshete. Professor Andreas Eshete was the former Chancellor or President of the Addis Ababa University, my former professor. He was on record saying that, in fact, he quoted Amartya Sen, who said that emergencies, difficult situations like natural disaster, like war, like epidemic, demand a democratic government only. And he says the best government that can deal with this kind of tragedies, this kind of emergencies, is only a democratically elected government. And in fact, he said, if COVID-19 is really a threat to public health in Ethiopia, then precisely for that reason, we need to run election and empower the government, give it a powerful democratic mandate to act on behalf of the people to avoid or handle the epidemiology, the epidemics that we are faced with. And as you can see from Farid's comment here, he says that everywhere, invariably, democracies handle COVID better than non-democratic systems. And he makes mention of all those countries where demagogues actually used the COVID phenomenon to attack, to repress people, to crack down upon them, to violate freedom of expression, to violate freedom, privacy, and so on and so forth. And that's precisely what was happening in Ethiopia. And that was precisely, in fact, in Ethiopia, it is different. COVID phenomenon is not just used to crack down upon opponents. The COVID phenomenon is used to extend power illegitimately, constitutionally, term of tenure, unconstitutionally, illegally, and indefinitely. And this is done through
you guys always say COVID-19 is a blessing for the Prime Minister to extend his power. Is that correct?
He has been waiting for this as an opportunity. In fact, the very first moment COVID-19 happened, in his meeting with his party members, party leadership, in the training process, one of the things he said is the COVID phenomenon must be exploited to enhance our electability. And we'll use it as an opportunity to make sure that our party becomes the dominant political party in this country. And it was indeed a blessing for them. It was indeed something that they haven't expected to have. And in fact, that's why they were basically trying to maneuver the constitutional process in order to extend their power unconstitutionally and illegally by using the electoral board and then Constitutional Inquiry Council.
Mm-hmm. Now, last week, Oromia in particular and Ethiopia in general witnessed a very unfortunate week. The assassination or killing of popular Oromo artist Hachalu Hundessa brought insecurity in Oromia and in Ethiopia in general. And following the assassination of artist Hachalu Hundessa, prominent Oromo politicians and political leaders have been detained for no reason, and I don't know how you describe the situation. Tell me if the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa was a politically motivated assassination.
Yes, I think the situation, as you said, is very enormously explosive at this point in time. It's a very unfortunate situation, unfortunate even in terms of the government people's calculations, because you don't do that kind of madness, such as assassinating Hachalu Hundessa, unless you want to really inflame anger in that country and make sure that everything goes out of your control. This is a country, Oromia is a people that has been already on the brink of exploding into protest because of being betrayed, because of being ignored for the large part of it, in fact being threatened by the regime of Abiy Ahmed's government. And Abiy Ahmed, it has not been unusual to see on social media people saying Abiy must go, Abiy must resign, Abiy must be removed, etc., for a long time. While that kind of anger was pending up, and now they came out and cracked down in a way that really is provocative. They attacked and assassinated a singer, a pop star, whose songs are the soundtrack, literally the soundtrack of the Oromo protest movement. This is a guy who is iconic to the Kero, to the young men and women who actually were behind the social protest movement throughout the many years now, about 5 or 4 years since the Oromo protests started. And that was a very terrible, terrible measure that whoever did it did when they assassinated Hachalu. Now, after the days of Hachalu, the reason we impute it to the prime minister is, number one week before the assassination, Hachalu was on Oromia Media Network on a very hard talk kind of debate where he spoke in opposition to the prime minister. He criticized the prime minister on many accounts, although he was also in part supportive of him. One of the things he criticized was the fact that Abiy Ahmed was basically ennobling former emperors that the Oromos considered to be an enemy. And he said that's a mistake. And soon after that, there were many calls for assassination or threats on his life and so on and so forth. And in 4 days' time, he was assassinated. So one of the reasons people attribute the assassination to Abiy's intimidation machine, the government's intimidation machine, is because of that link, that he made a public criticism on the media, and that threats and calls for assassination were all over on social media. And then when the measures came, everybody said this must be from the government. The second reason why people still attribute the killing to the government and consider it a political assassination rather than a random killing of a celebrity is because the government's position on the killing itself. The government did not establish an independent investigation process. Before the investigation happened, before the police gave any evidence about who the suspects are, the government told us who actually the culprits are. They said it is Egypt, it is TPLF, it is OLF together. And in fact, they also said there are also people operating from within, directly implicating people such as Jawar Mohammed, a member of an activist who turned out to be a politician and now joined the Oromo Federalist Congress, and Bakala Garba, the second person in charge of the OFC, and they directly attributed it to them. Now, the question for people was, why? How did you know? There was no investigation. We didn't know who did it. And then you are actually saying these are the people. And then suddenly, just a day after Hachalu's assassination, these two leaders, prominent Oromo political leaders, Jawar Mohammed and Bakala Garba, were also arrested and detained. The OMN, the institution, the media institution, was closed. And all the journalists, about 12 of them, the executive director, the chief editor, all of them are still in jail. When this happens, people considered the assassination not just a political assassination, but as a total crackdown, a total war, a provocative one at that, against the Oromo nation. And that actually inflamed emotions and angered so many people. And then the reaction was very, very brutal, as you have seen, lots of protest movements, and then the government repression, and then there are attacks and so on and so forth. And basically today, as we speak, the country, the region and the country is in chaos. That's where we are now.
Mm-hmm. Do you think the case of Hachalu Hundessa will get justice served? I mean, considering the experience of the government in the past years, like the assassination of Engineer Semenyo, the chief engineer of the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and the chief of staff of Ethiopian National Army. Do you think justice will be served here?
This is one of the reasons people are disillusioned with Abiy's regime, in particular in the area of justice, in the area of assassinations of high-profile politicians and public servants. Now, this is why he seems to be continuously implicated in these assassinations, in this series of assassinations. For the first time in Ethiopia since this reform, in fact, in many years, high-level political personalities have been assassinated. Assassination is a very rare phenomenon in Ethiopia. We haven't seen any. There are attempts foiled, but never successful assassinations. And when they happen, we know how to pinpoint them to the right persons. What happened in Ethiopia was in 2018, the chief engineer, the chief technician of the Renaissance Dam was assassinated. And they said after a while, it was a suicide. Then the chief of staff and his colleague were assassinated. Until today, justice hasn't been rendered. In fact, there was a court proceeding that started, and for no known reason, without even talking to the person who was present at the time of assassination on the scene, the wife of the chief of staff wasn't even considered as a primary witness. And then, for no reason we know so far, the proceeding started by the prosecutor was interrupted until just a few weeks ago. The Oromia Media Network interviewed the spouse of the chief of staff, and then when she really told us what happened in the area of investigation, in fact, what didn't happen in the area of investigation when it should have, then only the Attorney General said, we are going to restart this case, prosecuting this case. So that was one point at which people started to suspect that the government doesn't only render justice when harm has happened, but in fact, the government might be behind it from the very start. And now another case was the assassination of the president and his team, the president of the Amhara National Regional State and his team. On the same day, the chief of staff was assassinated. A whole host of people were assassinated. A number of them were attacked and wounded, and no investigation, no serious investigation was brought to the public. And people thought this was just a politically motivated assassination. And in fact, both the killer, the supposed killer, their opponent, and them became a hero in that particular region. No one could agree on what has happened. The system hasn't investigated it objectively, independently, and said this is where the responsibility lies. And to the extent it is imputed to the system, we apologize, we accept it. No, we haven't heard anything of this sort. If this is the case, you always think it's anywhere, by the way, anywhere, when a dangerous action has been committed under your watch as a government, and when you have not investigated it, when you have not clarified it, when you have not made the perpetrators responsible, and when you have not as a government taken a position on it, then it is imputed to you naturally, because you are a government responsible for the safety and security of people in that country. And throughout its regime, Abiy's government has a pattern of obfuscating, not clarifying, obfuscating, concealing rather than uncovering such assassinations. And when Hachalu's killings happened, when they immediately pointed to different kinds of people as the perpetrators, and when they said Jawar and Bakala Garba were responsible for this, and they arrested them. When they cracked down on OMN, when they arrested all the journalists, when they do that, people knew that there is not going to be justice for Hachalu Hundessa or for anyone. In fact, precisely because of those series of activities, people thought Abiy is the killer of Hachalu Hundessa. If I may say, my own personal opinion too concurs with what people think. And so there is no expectation that there will be justice done to the case of Hachalu.
Thank you. Yesterday, I saw a document submitted to the General Secretary of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. In that communication, in that memorandum, it says the vulnerable communities in Oromia, in particular, need protection. And as you know, following the assassination of Hachalu Hundessa and arrest of the popular political party leaders in Oromia like Jawar Mohammed and Bakala Garba, there have been a wide range of communities being attacked, in some part ethnically motivated attacks, and many non-Oromo people are being attacked, according to some reports coming from Oromia in particular. And considering these all facts on the ground, what does the report submitted to the General Secretary indicate, which is focusing particularly on the protection of the Oromo people, while these Oromo are already in Oromia?
I am not familiar with that report. I haven't yet seen it. But there are arguments I hear everywhere. There are statements on social media or otherwise on conventional media that there are attacks or at least communal violence in different parts of Oromia that happened during the course of the protest rallies protesting the assassination of Hachalu and the arrest of Jawar and Bakala Garba. And whenever they have come out to the streets for a protest, they also attacked other minorities within the region. That kind of complaint, I have heard it. I haven't got any concrete evidence for that. One of the reasons we don't get any concrete evidence is because there is no internet, no communication in the country at the moment. And there is no way we can get a credible evidence about what is happening where and what the government is doing to prevent that, or to make sure that perpetrators are held responsible. And given the fact that there is an internet blackout at this point in time, the fact that some people are really blaming the victim and talking about Oromos as the responsible party for various kinds of atrocities in a possible communal violence within that region held in the process of the protest is, I think, simply I think it's part of the problem that we have to look at very carefully. The reason is because if there is no internet connection, if there is no independent investigation, if there is no transparency from the part of the government about what is going on where, how did these people know exactly some people are targeted for attack? And how is it that the attack is only unidirectional? It's one direction. That, I think, is suspect. But nonetheless, at no point in time should any vulnerable group be attacked. And it's obvious that when such a commotion happens, always the vulnerable groups are the primary candidates for victimization, and that's unfortunate, and that should be condemned, and that should be denounced at every possible opportunity. And if there is one, I think the government must be held responsible for this, and the government must intervene as fast as possible to protect minorities, to prevent such kind of communal atrocities, because that isn't good for the country, that isn't good for Oromia, that isn't good for the democracy that we all want to have in that country. Because without minority protection, there is no democratic group at all.
Now in Ethiopia, we have a prime minister who won the Nobel Peace Prize. And in Ethiopia, we are witnessing a wide range of insecurity across the country. if we see the relation TPLF has with the central government, the Tigray regional government, and the federal government is very unhealthy, and this situation has been exacerbating every time, and the African Union, IGAD, and the United Nations are now alerted about this, because the Tigray regional government has sent a memorandum to almost 62 countries and international organizations alerting on the exacerbating security situation in Ethiopia. And still now the international community seems to be very hopeful on the achievement and performance of the Prime Minister. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's very unfortunate. The international community is misled to believe that this Prime Minister is a very competent, reforming, powerful Prime Minister. That's unfortunate because we think he's misled because they are misled because primarily because he was given the Nobel Peace Prize, and the Nobel Peace Prize, we believed at the time, was a little too early. It was given a little too early and was a little premature because he wasn't tested and tried as to whether he deserves it or not. But again, sometimes the Nobel Peace Prize is given not for what you have done, but for what you will do. It was more like a responsibility imposed on you to spur you on, to encourage you to do much better, to fit the legacy of the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think we also understood that. And in spite of that, even when the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to him, it wasn't for his strengths on domestic security matters, for ensuring domestic security and domestic governance matters are going well. We knew that there were a lot of misgivings. In fact, the moment of the decision itself was divisive in Ethiopia, because some part of the nation was celebrating and some part of the nation was saying, what the hell is going on? Because people had so many disaffections, discontents, and some kind of frustrations that were really in the build-up. And the reason for the international community is apparently misled is because of the propaganda, because of very media-savvy approach that the Prime Minister uses, the fact that he uses the media very effectively, the camera very effectively, public relations very effectively, although not anymore. Because when he shows up on meetings, substantively he has a lot to be desired about his performance, and gradually the international community is waking up to what he actually is, not just for us at home, but at the international level. One case that one can mention in this regard is the negotiations around the Renaissance Dam with Egypt, in which they involved the World Bank and the American government. And then after every meeting, there is always a fallout. And the fallout is because what he agrees to at the international negotiating table and what he tells the Ethiopian public are different. And when the Ethiopian public react to the situation, then he reneges on his commitment at the international level. And people are now fed up, even at the international level. He's not a credible ally to work with. They don't know that he is really competent to manage some important international regional issues. One of the things that I remember the American diplomats were very angry about was there was a security briefing, the discussion by this big CIA officials and State Department officials, and it was a large team of people from the American government who were sitting down with the government of Ethiopia, and it was intelligence personnel, it was State Department personnel, it was regional diplomats, and so on and so forth. And a host of these diplomats were met only by one individual person, Abiy Ahmed, the Prime Minister, with no staff, no other experts, no technician listening to what they have to say. And they were shocked. They said, he made us alone and we didn't know how we can discuss technical issues with him. And they were already getting, even the international community, for example, the American diplomats, which have a lot of interest in the regional geopolitical security issues in the area. After discussing with him in this way, they said, something is not right here. And there is a lot of frustration building up, even among the members of the international community operating within the region. So in some ways, it was a premature bestowal of the honor of Peace Prize. It was a premature bestowal of recognition of Abiy's achievement in terms of negotiating peace, but it was not mindful of his inadequacies domestically. And when the domestic issues are beyond control now, the international legitimacy doesn't hold. It's falling off already. It's shading already. And in fact, Abiy is a very, very calculated, very shrewd manager of public image. And he knew from Ethiopia's past, from Emperor Haile Selassie's past, that if you get international legitimacy, then the domestic will be easy to manage. The domestic issues will be easy to manage. And that's how he worked for it. He wanted to make sure that the international community is going to clap for him. Once that is done, he will know how to handle the domestic problems. But that, I think, is a misplaced kind of expectation. You have to be very careful about your constituency. And I think the most important constituency for any politician alive today, or any time at all, is your own people. If you get it right at the domestic level, you can't miss it at the international level. If you get it right at the international level, there is a high probability in this neoliberal global kind of system. If you get it right at the international level, you have to be very careful that you might not get it. You have to be very mindful that there is a likelihood that you will not get it right at the domestic level. And that's what happened to Abiy Ahmed. Domestically, he is a mess. And today, we don't know how long his regime will continue in power because of the many catastrophic mistakes he has made and many catastrophic measures he has taken, especially in his home-based constituency, which is Oromia. And that, I think, is going to be the place where he will pay the most.
Mm-hmm. And talking about election, now Tigray regional government is set to hold regional election in Tigray in the coming 2 months. And this has become a contentious issue with the federal government. The federal government has already postponed the issue of election by 1 year, or some say indefinitely. Now, how are you going to describe the legal ground for Tigray government to hold regional election? Because this has been a very contentious issue, raising constitutional issues whether Tigray government has the right to hold regional election or not. How do you describe that?
Yep. The Ethiopian government, the federal parliament, has agreed to extend the term of the power, the tenure of the prime minister and the parliament and the regional governments as well, completely unconstitutionally. That was an utterly unconstitutional kind of approach taken by the Constitutional Inquiry Council. Nonetheless, be that as it may, they might extend the, legally that's completely unacceptable, by the way. Why is this so? According to the Constitution, Article 58, Article 54, the parliament is elected for 5 years. And according to Article 38, the parliament's term of tenure will be renewed only through election. Okay? And now they said because of COVID-19, because there is an emergency declaration made, because of the fact that the emergency situation does not allow for people to meet and congregate to do an election, we have to do without election. And if you have to do without election, then we have to extend the power of the existing parliament, the existing government. And that, I think, is completely inappropriate, that is completely unconstitutional. But be that as it may, the Constitutional Inquiry Council and then later the House of Federation said the election will not be conducted until the World Health Organization has decided that COVID-19 is no more a public health threat, and the Ethiopian Parliament has decided that it is no more a threat, and then within 9 to 12 months from that moment of decision, there might be an election. So basically, this is an indefinite postponement of the election for the federal government. From what I understand as a constitutional lawyer of Ethiopia, as someone who reads and studies the Ethiopian constitution, is that you cannot be in power without election. You cannot extend the power of an existing parliament or prime minister without its power, its mandate renewed through democratic election. You can't go around this. There is just no way. Be that as it may, Abiy has mobilized his institutions, the National Electoral Board, the Constitutional Inquiry Council, the Parliament, then later the House of Federation, to allow himself a power without any election. But the regions have their own constitutions. According to their own constitutions, power is assumed only through election. And now when the term of office is going to expire by the end of September 2020, the regional governments will experience a power vacuum. To avoid that, the Tigray National Regional Government had earlier on said, we want to have election. You cannot allow ourselves to rule over our people without any democratic mandate. And the federal government said, you can't. And the federal parliament, the Federal National Electoral Board, it's not a federal, it's a national electoral board, given the power to facilitate and implement, execute the electoral processes everywhere. They said, without our permission, you cannot conduct election. That's very interesting kind of twist to this political drama. The reason is the National Electoral Board's responsibility is to hold an election, to make sure that electoral process is election is conducted, to make sure that government is accountable, i.e. government should facilitate election when its term is about to expire. But it cannot say you cannot have election unless I permit it. It doesn't have the mandate to permit or disallow election. So what it can do was basically to say, I cannot do it if it is not ready, which in itself is actually a betrayal of its constitutional responsibility. Okay, but they can say that and they can keep away from the situation. Because of COVID-19, I don't have enough staff, enough logistical preparation, to make sure to facilitate the election in Tigray. They can say that. But instead of saying that, the National Electoral Board chief came out and said, unless I approve it, the election that is being conducted in Tigray is not accepted. And I think that is an inappropriate statement. And that created a sense of confrontation between the Tigray National Regional Government on the one hand and the federal government on the other, led by Abiy Ahmed. And there was already a sense of confrontation and the sense of, in fact, there was threats from the part of the federal government to attack them, to make sure that they are they have come in within the fold. There are times when they were trying to negotiate by sending elders, and there are times when they were asking some politicians to be co-opted into the Prosperity Party, and so on and so forth. So that remains to be unresolved. There is a shuttle of elders going between the two people now, the Tigrayan government in Mekelle and the Abiy's regime in Addis Ababa, until, of course, this catastrophe that leads to the killing of Hajalu happened. So it is absolutely unconstitutional that election is postponed. It is absolutely legitimate for a regional government to run election if the situation allows it. In fact, the federal government should be worried if any region says, I'm not going to have election when it should. But if someone says, I should have an election in spite of the problems, you should encourage them, you should support them, you should allow them to have their self-rule exercised there. But instead, the Ethiopian government is basically trying to crack down upon the regional government of Tigray, and that has led to a situation in which now there could even be a war, there could even be all sorts of things. You can never tell what the outcome of this confrontation would be. And that's very, very unfortunate. And this is why I say the situation is a crisis situation, and the crisis is deepening by the day, and we don't exactly know how it will turn out in the coming days and months to come.
Mm-hmm. Now, Dr. Tsagai, in your recent interviews, you have shown consistently that the two houses, the House of Federation and the House of People's Representatives, they have acted beyond their mandate in amending the constitution, in postponing the election and extending the power of the prime minister. So can we say we don't have a legitimate House of People's Representatives and House of Federation as of September, end of September?
A lot of interesting developments have happened in that area. But what hasn't happened is constitutional amendment, by the way. They have indeed extended the power of the federal government, the parliament, and of the term of tenure of the federal parliament and the federal executive, and that's unconstitutional. They have postponed the election, and that too is unconstitutional. They haven't amended it. In fact, amendment could have been a more legitimate kind of a more legitimate way of approaching the whole situation. One of the things they could have said is that the term of office of the parliament and the executive in power can be extended in situations where election cannot be conducted because of this and this. They could have inserted such a provision, okay, and amended it. And according to the amended constitution, they can extend the term of office in exceptional situations. You know, they could have gone that way. They actually said, no, we're not going to amend the constitution. Reason, because amendment of the constitution requires that people have to discuss the proposed amendment. And that cannot be done because of the COVID-19 situation. And that cannot be done under circumstances where there is a state of emergency. That's the kind of logic they have come up with. What happened instead was to find a legal mechanism through which they can legitimize what is actually unconstitutional. Okay? Instead, they said, instead of amending the constitution and extending the term of office of the prime minister and the federal parliament, and then because of that, extend the time of the election. Instead of doing this, what they went about doing is, as it stands now, breaking the constitution, how do we continue to be in power, was Abiy's method. And what they did was, first, they asked the National Electoral Board to say that it is unable to conduct the election at the appointed time. And secondly, they took that to the parliament, and the parliament, Abiy actually made the parliament agree to the proposal of the National Electoral Board to postpone the election. Then they forced, he actually used the parliament to refer the issue to the constitutional interpreter, the Constitutional Inquiry Council, for it to interpret the constitution so that they can legitimize the extension of the power of the prime minister without any electoral mandate. Okay, whether it is possible to be in power without any election in such circumstances. That was the question that they took to the Constitutional Inquiry Council. Constitutional Inquiry Council did a very much farcical spectacle, televised spectacle of hearing And in the end, they did not even interpret the constitution. First and foremost, when the law is clear, you cannot interpret it. But when the law is clear and when there is a gap, a lacuna, as we say in law, one of the things that you do is to construct, not to interpret, but to construct, meaning to find a way of covering what is not literally covered by the constitution. And the exercise we thought would be a process of constructing something from the existing edifice of the constitution, so that they can say, this is how we should understand the constitutional system, and this is how, by using that, the government can renew its mandate. But instead of that, they just came up with an order saying there shall be no election. That's because of COVID, and that's also because of some kind of threat to national security, like a war coming from Egypt and so on and so forth. Completely illegal, completely irrelevant to the legal system, the legal interpretation they were expected to offer. And in the end, the House of Federation was supposed to endorse this. Just before the endorsement, 3 days before the endorsement of this decision, the Speaker of the House of Federation resigned, saying that this is simply an unconstitutional approval of the Prime Minister's ambition to stay in power and to undo the federation, to undo the constitutional system. And she said, given the fact that I am expected to be loyal to A, to the constitution, B, to my constituency, C, to my conscience, I cannot sit and preside over this House of Federation in this situation. And she resigned on a Sunday before the final decision was to be rendered on Wednesday. And in spite of her resignation, it was a big political statement she made in relation to this. The Prime Minister went on and had the House of Federation elect another speaker. And with that speaker, they endorsed the proposal of the Constitutional Inquiry Council, which basically said we have to extend the power of the federal executive and also the regional executives and the regional parliaments. And that was utterly unconstitutional. And as a constitutional lawyer, I was taken aback by that decision. And I said, well, now politics has complete precedence over constitution, politics over law, and it is hopeless to engage this government with the instrumentality of the.
Mm-hmm. My last question to you is, Dr. Tsagai, about the deteriorating Ethiopia's role in the region, in East Africa, especially in the Horn. Ethiopia and Eritrea relation, the agreement is not working well. The expectation on the ground was too much, and unfortunately, the Ethiopia-Eritrea relation is not smooth enough on the ground. And there is clear constitutional crisis in Ethiopia following the illegal amendment, postponement of the election and extension of the term of the Prime Minister. How do you gauge the power of Ethiopia, considering Ethiopia's previous strong stance in Africa, in East Africa, especially in maintaining peace and security, and geopolitically, Ethiopia was almost controlling the East African politics. How about now?
Yes, because of the deteriorating security situations within the country, and because of the complete ineptness of the Prime Minister in terms of managing foreign relations, in terms of managing geopolitical situations, in terms of managing friendships with governments in the region, now the regional security and stability situation is completely in a mess. For the first time, perhaps, because as you know, in the region, Ethiopia is a very important partner. In the region, Ethiopia's foreign policy is basically the touchstone of how to stabilize the entire region. It's the cornerstone of geopolitical security and relations in that country, in that area. Ethiopia's foreign policy was very bureaucratic, very rigid for many years, as we know. But this time around, that policy was completely ignored, and the diplomatic the core, the Foreign Office, was simply bypassed by the Prime Minister. And in some ways, people thought this is very progressive, this is less bureaucratic, this is fast-moving diplomacy, personal diplomacy of the Prime Minister getting us way, and so on and so forth. But there is a limit to personal diplomacy, especially when you are informed by not the concerns of peace and regional stability, but rather by pragmatic concerns of ensuring political authority and legitimacy at home. And the calculation is that Ethiopia was supposed to have a foreign policy that is run with integrity, even in the relationship with Eritrea, in the peace deal in relation to the border dispute. We still don't know exactly what the terms of agreement were. We still don't know about it. And national interest, according to the Constitution, national interest, brotherhood among African neighbors, with African neighbors, and the commitment to peaceful settlement of disputes. These are the core principles guiding the Ethiopian foreign policy objectives, according to the Constitution. Now, which means when you deal with any country in that area or beyond the region, you have to make sure that your policy should be guided by the basic principles of the Constitution and the age-old foreign policy parameters of the Ethiopian government. And because foreign policy is one of the things that transcend regimes, one regime comes and goes, but the foreign policy remains the same because our foreign interest remains the same. But when you want to change the way things are run in the country by using your personal leadership quality, and when you want to take that model and apply it to foreign relations, trying to say, I will change everything by using personal diplomacy and to have my personal diplomatic skills to have a sway, you will have a lot to compromise. You will have a lot to destabilize in the integrity of the foreign relations, the foreign policy system of the country. And this is precisely what happened with regard to Abiy. The reason is, I think, in my view, his activities in the region, however laudable he was in achieving peace with Eritrea, his activity was not guided by principle, but by pragmatics. Not a virtuous kind of pragmatics, but a pragmatics that is very sinister to establish his political power at home and to attack his domestic opponents, especially in Tigray. That was basically the thing that guided the relationship with Eritrea. And that's precisely why the Eritrean president is always using Abiy as a proxy to fight against the Tigrayan leadership within the regional government. And this is one of the ugly things that have really brought us into the precipice in the region at the moment. And then he had a lot of responsibilities in relation to negotiating a deal in the Sudan, in the South Sudan, and that area is fraught with all sorts of conflicts and insecurities in Somalia, the port issue in Djibouti, and so on and so forth. And in all of these, the activities of Abiy Ahmed, which were only premised upon pragmatics of staying in power in Ethiopia and consolidating his power against his potential opponents, mainly the Tigrayan elite in Mekelle, that has actually led us into a situation where not just the domestic insecurity is overflowing, but also the regional stability is now completely difficult to tell with some degree of certainty. One of the issues that we see there is the issue of the Renaissance Dam, which we have referred to several times in this case. The Renaissance Dam, as you know, has been a very big national sovereignty, national project that was pegged on the principle of national sovereignty of Ethiopia, economic sovereignty of Ethiopia, meaning a dam that we are going to construct without any support from international institutions and so on and so forth. That's ABC and a basic definition of economic sovereignty. And that dam, as important as it is for this purpose, that dam was compromised because of the diplomatic mishaps that were committed by the Prime Minister in the process of playing Eritrea against other neighbors and kind of becoming very inadequate in negotiating skills with all other neighboring countries. And in fact, instead of focusing on those neighboring countries to gang up relationships, especially the upper riparian regions countries, instead of using them to take the negotiation, to allow the negotiation to take its course, he focused on the international organizations, IMF and World Bank and the United States, and involving the United States now in the negotiation is making Ethiopia pay dearly for the building of the dam. And this is the result of the diplomatic blunder that the Prime Minister made, partly out of miscalculation and the interest to consolidate power against his opponents within the country, and partly because of utter inability and incompetence in the area of international diplomacy.
You mentioned the main reason Prime Minister Abiy became a friend of President Isaias of Eritrea is to weaken the TPLF, the ruling party in the Tigray region. How is that possible to conspire against your own people with a foreign country? Is that something people should believe?
Well, you wouldn't expect that to happen, and especially from a prime minister who actually said we're going to build a region that is very big for everybody, and that's his philosophy of Medamar. He's going to bring nations together, and he's going to make Ethiopia great and make Ethiopia a big regional power, and so on and so forth. You wouldn't expect that he gangs up a foreign power against a regional, a domestic unit of a federation. But from all indications are, and some of their media moguls recently, one of the most favorite journalists of the Prime Minister, Sisai Agena, was saying that we should shrug off our sovereignty and invite Eritrea to deal severely militarily with the leadership in Tigray. And this has been going on for a while, formally, informally, through social media, mainstream media, saying that Prime Minister Abiy is going to use the military might of Eritrea to attack and subdue, so to say, subdue the Tigrayan leadership into submission, and so that they can fall into the fold, into the Abiy's prosperity fold. That's very unfortunate, but this is something that we hear every day, and in fact, it has become almost obvious to every ordinary person in Ethiopia today that Abiy wants to, and in some corners, should use Eritrea to attack the Tigrayan elite, which political elite, which basically said we're not going to accept any unconstitutional, illegal mechanism of staying in power when we can actually have an election and get a popular mandate within our region. And this is very unfortunate. This is very treasonous, really. I mean, it's a high treason. You can't conspire against your own people, especially by invoking the power of a military power at that, of a regional neighbor. That I think is very disastrous, and it's shameful even to talk about. And I just don't know how to explain this. How is it that we can explain to the international community saying that our prime minister conspires with a neighboring country to attack a domestic opponent, a particular region within the federation? That is very difficult to explain to people, but that's the phenomenon we find ourselves in, unfortunately.
Dr. Tsagay Rogasa Ararsa, thank you for sharing your time with us. This is TMH viewers. Thank you for watching. We will meet again next time. Bye for now from Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Right now, you have the power to amplify the voices of over 40 million people with one hashtag. In September 2016, we made a video just like this.
We wish we weren't doing this again.
But here we are, and in the next few minutes, we're going to tell you exactly why.
On the night of June 29th,
Hachalu Hundessa, an iconic Oromo singer and activist,
was assassinated in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's capital.
A city known to the Oromo as Finfinne.
We don't know who pulled the trigger, but there are a lot of things that we do know.
Like, just a week prior, Hachalu gave an interview on the Oromia Media Network,
where he expressed his sincere concerns regarding the current Ethiopian government.
He shared suppressed truths about Menelik II and shined a light on Ethiopia's real history.
Hachalu's music served as the soundtrack of the revolution during the 2016 Oromo protests.
Songs that are a continuous reminder to the Oromo that they have the right to self-determine their future.
The Oromia Media Network was raided by the military one day after his death, and its journalists were arrested.
Over 100 people have been killed by security forces in 3 days, and with the internet shut down,
it is impossible to know what is really going on in the country.
To really understand what all this means, we need to give you more information
about the activities of the Ethiopian government since Abiy Ahmed assumed leadership in April 2018.
Hailed for his reforms and a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, not long after the nation and the world celebrated his efforts, things started to change.
Opposition leaders who have legal standing to operate in Ethiopia were being arbitrarily arrested and remain so today.
Military command posts were set up. Beatings and killings began in Walaga, Guji and Borana, all Oromo regions.
And this following point right here is very important for you to understand.
In a country that is supposed to be a constitutional multinational federation, Abiy dissolved the multinational structure of the government.
An extremely worrisome development for the Oromo and all nations and nationalities in Ethiopia who seek self-rule and self-determination.
What we have to remember is that Abiy Ahmed is not an elected leader.
And he's made little effort to ensure free and fair elections since his appointment.
It is in this context, and in the context of an Ethiopia that sees prominent Oromos murdered, that we assert that Hachalu Hundessa was assassinated.
Over 40 million people are still in shock and in mourning.
Hachalu's uncle was killed by the military 2 days after his nephew's assassination.
And it's what's happening in Ethiopia right now that we must give our attention to.
Leaders of the Oromo Federalist Congress, Jawar Mohammed, Bekele Garba, Hamza Borana, and at least 35 other leaders, activists and journalists are being detained without having committed any crime.
The Makalawi prison, a notorious torture chamber that Abiy closed
as part of his initial reform, is where these leaders are currently being illegally held.
We know they've been physically assaulted while detained. Jawar is on a hunger strike and Bekele is very ill.
2 US citizens, Redwan Aman and Yusuf Bashir, are unlawfully detained and we still don't know where they are.
We all anticipated a national reconciliation process to take place when Abiy assumed his position.
It could have happened. It could have changed the direction of Ethiopia for good. But it didn't.
And in light of this moment, for the Oromo and every other nation and nationality in Ethiopia, our demands are clear.
An independent external investigation into Hachalu Hundessa's assassination.
The immediate resignation of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed.
The end of extrajudicial killings of civilians. The release of all political prisoners. Free and fair elections in 2020.
An end to the internet and phone line shutdown.
And finally, we demand that the international community impose immediate sanctions on Ethiopia if these demands are not met.
We will no longer be satisfied with symbolic victories. The Oromo demand real justice.
I am Oromo.
We are Oromo.
I stand
with Oromo protests.
Do you?